Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell. And in today's news, a lot of companies are struggling with what to do in terms of requiring people to come back to work. Do they want everyone in the office, hybrid, work remote, what? Well, today my guest has insights that are going to help all of us get a better understanding of how to make any combination of these possibilities work. I'd like to welcome Kevin Eikenberry back to my show. Kevin, so great to have you with me today.
Meredith, it's a pleasure to be with you as always, whether the record button is on or not.
I agree. I've known Kevin for more than 12 years. I was counting it up. And I want to say he is an exceptional leader and to me, a very special human being. He was my guest for episode 82, almost exactly 2 years ago, Kevin, when we discussed the book, The Long Distance Teammate. And I invited Kevin to come back to talk to us about his latest book, which I have right here, which is called The Long Distance Team. And this one is about consciously designing teams and defining and creating culture, encouraging and nurturing employee engagement, all from a distance. And Kevin knows what he's talking about, not just because he's worked with a lot of organizations around this, but because he himself has been leading a long distance team since long before people even knew what that was. And I'm going to
when Corona was still a beer, is what I tell people.
Well, one of the things I want to start with, Kevin, I know you've been busy the last 2 years, and your earlier two books addressed, actually the one before these two was The Long Distance Leader, and then we had The Long Distance Teammate. And so what's different, and what was it that compelled you to write a third one about the team itself?
Well, so long distance. So again, thanks for having me, Meredith. It's a pleasure to be with you. So the long distance leader came long before the pandemic, and because we'd been working with leaders and organizations who had people working remote globally, perhaps, or whatever, and then we were finishing the manuscript for Long Distance Teammate when the pandemic hit. So we knew that we wanted leaders to be more effective in that what we now think about as the long distance work life. And we knew that team members and teammates had things that they could do to be more effective and to make a bigger difference and to still be visible and all those things. So we did that. And then we thought about what we had missed or what we hadn't yet talked about. And we started listening to what our customers were telling us. And we wanted to talk about teams and culture. And so, during this last period of time, we wrote this book, and it just came out a couple of weeks ago as when people are, if you watch this when it first comes out or listen to it when it first comes out in the last couple of weeks. So it really is a book that's designed to answer the questions that people are struggling with now. I mean, you opened by talking about how it relates to talent attraction and retention, which it certainly does. But so many organizations now, even this far into or post-pandemic, however you want to say that, are still struggling with, well, what is it really going to look like? Are we really going to bring everybody back? Can we, should we? And whatever form our workplace is going to take, how does that impact our culture? How does that impact our teams? And what we found is that, first of all, the word culture gets misunderstood, is very much misunderstood. And the second thing is that why would we expect that our teams should look the way that they did in the before times when the world and the context of work has changed so much. We need to, we're in this moment of time when we ought to be asking ourselves these questions. We're not in the throes of the pandemic where we just are trying to get things out the door, right? And keep people safe. And we're in this place of, we're still trying to figure out what our future of work is going to look like. And now is the time to raise these questions and to answer these questions. That's why we wrote the book.
No, I loved it because, and I highly recommend anyone who is working with a team or anyone is outside of the office, whether it's 100% remote or just partial, because this is really, I thought of it as a handbook, actually, Kevin, because you really lay out some very practical steps and guidelines for doing, to me, two really important things. One is designing the team, and the other is paying attention to the culture you want to create. And so I want to talk about each of those for a few minutes, because when you think about designing a team, one of the things you emphasize is involving the entire team in that process, as opposed to coming up with it yourself and then explaining it or introducing it. What are the benefits and why is that so important to involve everyone in that process?
Yeah, I love that question. So let's start here. That on one level, there have been leaders that we've been working with for the last 3 years who have been in many ways immobilized by the fact that, how am I supposed to figure all this out? Like, how do I like, we're in uncharted territory. How am I supposed to have all the answers? And my response always is, why do you have to have all the answers? You got a whole team of people, whether that's 3 or 33 or 3,333, who have all been living this too. Why aren't you engaging them in their thoughts about what's working for them, what's not working for them? So that's the first part. That's sort of the practical piece of it. Mm-hmm. But there's a bigger question. And Meredith, you sort of mentioned that, I've been working with leaders for a very long time. And I have come to determine that perhaps the single most important question that a leader must answer is this: are you leading for merely compliance, or are you leading for commitment? And if you truly are leading for commitment, and now, so I used to just say, are you leading for compliance or commitment? And people say, well, we've got compliance, we've got legal stuff, we've got safety stuff. Yeah. That's why I now say simply compliance. Like, is that enough? And I don't think anyone thinks that's enough. Although that's how many people are actually leading, is to get to the place, well, do it because I said. Mm-hmm. Right? If you really do want commitment, then you got smart people. You got to engage them in the process. You're not the only, not only don't you have all the answers, how could you possibly have all the answers? Why would it make sense for you to go into your office or your third bedroom in the basement or whatever, and like come up with, or on the beach, and try to come up with what my team should look like? Why? Even if you're really smart, and you probably are, you're going to end up with something that's based on your view of the world and not something that takes into the account all the perspectives, all the points of view of everyone on your team. And the chances of you getting the levels of commitment that you want from it are not very high.
And so what are some of the questions that a leader needs to be thinking about to ask the team? I guess a fundamental question is, well, what does it mean to design a team? What are we trying to do when we say design a team?
Well, so we have framed it around sort of 3 big areas, which I'll get to in a second. But what does it mean to design a team, rather than just having people show up and here we are? Or I've had 6 people on my team forever. Well, did the nature of the way things happened and the way it was designed and the interrelationships between those people and the communication between all those people, was it the same before we sent some of us home to work? And has it stayed the same? And is that still the right answer moving forward? If we don't ask ourselves that, we just sort of live with what we got, right? So designing a team or redesigning a team is about saying, how should we be structured? How should the work be apportioned in a way that makes the most sense. And it takes into account the people themselves, but it's not just like the names in the boxes, right? It's how do we need to be set up? And how do we need to set expectations for ourselves to improve the chances that we reach the outcomes that we're here to reach, and that we can keep getting better at doing that. So in terms of a framework, we created a framework that we've been using and we wrote about in the book that says when you're designing your team or when you're working on your culture, either one, you need to think about 3 C's, and that most of the questions at the end of the day will fall inside of one of these 3 C's. And those 3 C's are communication, collaboration, and cohesion. And if you think about all of the angst and all of the issues and all of the challenges that people have been thinking about and talking about and writing about for the last 3 years, they come down to that. How do we communicate with those people if we're not all together? Maybe we're global, or maybe we're the next zip code, but we're not in the same building. How do we communicate? How do we collaborate? And how cohesive are we? And the connections between us and the relationships amongst us and the trust that we have or don't have, et cetera, et cetera. So the questions all are for, and so, okay, Kevin, I want to ask my team how we should be designed. And as you said, the book is designed to be very practical and can walk you through all of it. But it's framed around those 3 C's. What are the issues and challenges and desires around communication, around collaboration, and around cohesion?
Mm-hmm. And so talk about the distinction you make then between the designing of a team and the creating of a culture, because I think those are 2 important distinctions too, and how the 3 C's work into the culture creation.
Well, let's answer the culture question, and I think then based on what we've already talked about teams, it will fall apart and make sense. So here's what, like a lot of people like you and I, Meredith, who write and speak and consult and train and do podcasts, I've been talking about culture for a long time, and the volume on it has turned up to 10, in the last couple of years. And it's like you turn up the volume on the stereo. Like, I'm old, so like on the stereo, when you turn up the volume, at some point the speakers start to crackle and the sound gets distorted. And that's what's happened with all of our conversation about culture, because the more we've talked about it and the louder it's got, the less we understand it. Here's all culture is: the way we do things around here. That's all it is. And so designing of the team is, how are we structured? How are we set up? And then the culture is, how's actually happening? What's actually happening? What are we really doing? Not what's on the piece of paper or on the process document, but like, how are we really communicating? How are we really collaborating? How, et cetera, et cetera. And what I have found, Meredith, is that we're really in a time where most organizations have 3 cultures to consider. They have the culture that they used to have, right? The one that many people are opining for. Well, we just want to get back to the culture the way we used to have it. In fact, some people say there isn't a culture unless you're all physically together, which is just silliness, because we're still getting work done. We're still doing work, right? So, but the culture we had, the culture we have, which is clearly different, some ways probably better, some ways maybe not as good, not as effective, right? But culture we had, culture we have, culture we want. And this, and as you know from looking at the book, that we're really trying to help people think about the fact that you have a culture, but what's the one that you aspire to? What's the one that you really, truly want? What's the one that would help the organization be super successful and attract the right talent and retain the right talent and make it a place where people want to be and want to thrive?
And, one of the other distinctions you make in there that I really like and is so true is, if we have an organization that, says this is our culture or this is what we see, whether they announce it or not, but at the team level, the leader really wants to create a really positive culture within that team, what are some things that they can do no matter what's going on in the larger organization, or can they work separately, even if they're different?
That's a super important question. And I'll answer the first part last. Yes, we can. We talk about there being a macro culture, there's an organizational culture. Like if you got 50 or 500 or however many employees, like you have a macro culture, and then you have the micro culture on your team. Like, listen, you've walked into any organization and went from one department to the other, to one team to another, and you know that it's not exactly the same. It's not completely different, but it's not the same. Macro culture, micro culture. So can a leader work on the culture of their team, what we would call the microculture? 100%, right? Would we love for people to think about some of these practices on an organizational macro culture level? Of course we would, but this is not meant to be, well, man, I need to give a copy of this to someone else because I can't do anything. No, you can, even if you're a team member. Because how we all interrelate every day is the culture is adjusting every day, right? So why not have it be adjusting to a place we'd like it to go rather than just where it shows up?
What have you seen be effective for a team that has really aspired to and achieved a very healthy culture among its own members? What can they do to help spread that to other parts of the organization that may not be operating at that same level?
Just keep doing it. Like if what you're doing and the way you're interacting and the way you're communicating, the way you're collaborating, right? If it's really working for your team, people are going to notice, right? Yeah, we can go out and try to, convert the masses, right? I have no problem with that. But the single best thing we can do to be influential is to simply keep moving towards the aspirational culture we want on our team, and people will notice and say, man, I want some of that. I've said that to leaders for years around meetings. And I was having a conversation with Chris Dyer, who's a fabulous author and ran a very successful company he's recently sold. And he and I were talking about the fact that we can learn a lot about an organization's culture by watching their meetings. Right. And so I've said to leaders for years, here's how to run better meetings, and don't lament that others aren't doing it. Just start doing it with your meetings. And as your meetings get better, people are going to say, what's Meredith doing? Meredith's doing something. Her meetings are different than everybody else's. What's she doing? And they might just watch you, or they might ask you, or whatever. But the reality is you become the pebble in the pond that creates the ripples. And the same thing is true for our culture. The best thing we can do as a team, if we want to influence more broadly, is just keep doing it. Just keep getting better at it as a team, and not with ego, but just by doing the work.
I love that advice, because I think it's so true. When we are pointing the finger looking for somebody else to change, and we're not working on it ourselves, it's a little difficult to have credibility.
My dad used to say, Kevin, when you point your finger at someone, and if you're watching, you can see, when you point your finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. So I started pointing with an open hand, but the point he was making was there's always something.
Yes, there's always work to be done.
There's always part of it that you have accountability for. And he was absolutely right. And of course, I didn't realize how right he was originally, but eventually I got there.
Yeah, and the more we see people who tend to blame, and we notice the ripple effect of that kind of behavior versus taking responsibility and taking initiative, it kind of makes me think about this other area, which is, what about creating either the designing of a team or the creating of a culture? What's the difference between somebody coming into a brand new situation with a new team, or a new team has been formed, versus trying to make changes to an existing team? Are there any differences in the approach one should take?
Well, I think that the general approach is the same, right? Like think about the 3 C's, involve folks in what you want it to look like. And let me just say something about the brand new team. Some organizations, some leaders have used things like team charters, and certainly a team charter is a piece of the kinds of things we're thinking about, right? That you may have used a charter to help sort of set some things. All of that's certainly part of what we're talking about here. Now, there's always a difference between we've got something moving in motion that we're used to and we know versus we got a blank sheet of paper, right? And there are challenges and opportunities to both. Blank sheet of paper, like I don't even know where to start, and the book will help you think about that. We got something going on already. Well, we got habits, and can we change? Like, what are the sacred cows? Like, so both sides have some challenges, but the overall idea is what do we want? How do we create culture or team that will help us be more successful in every way in the future, right? And so the challenge for the new team is people are bringing in their own biases, but we have the chance to start fresh. With the existing team is we have existing habits that we might have to think about overcoming, or that might create blind spots to be aware of.
Yeah. I was thinking as I was hearing you talk, this whole idea of having to lay new pathways in the brain, whether it's a brand new team and we still have old pathways from other teams we've been on, other situations. It's not like we're coming in with a blank slate. So either way.
But the difference now is, sorry to interrupt, but the difference now is that everyone's got their own pathway and they may not all be exactly the same. So that's a different set of issues for us to deal with than when we've all sort of got the same point of view because we've been on the same team.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
for sure.
And this ties in with one of my favorite chapters at the end when you start talking about the difference between expectations and agreements. And I just think this is so important to talk a little bit more about what's your definition, because some people might use those words interchangeably, but I feel they're very different, and I was glad to see you do too. So what's each of those?
I think first of all, there's an awful lot of leaders that need to get a whole lot better at setting clear expectations. So first of all, expectations and agreements, I would say, are like cousins, right? They're not totally different things. They're just not exactly the same, right? And the idea of an expectation is here's what success looks like, right? And if Meredith, if I work for you and we have some clear expectations, then I have a sense of what success looks like for me, which is awesome. I need to know that. Great, right? And the reality is that when we think about a team, we're not thinking about it the same way, right? Like if you're my boss, we can have a conversation about expectations, and I may have expectations of you as well, but the reality is that because of the difference in our positional power differential, the reality is that there's sort of, you need to take the lead on that to say, here's, and you have a perspective to say, this is the job, right? And here's what it looks like to be successful in this job. Expectations. Many leaders aren't good enough at doing this well, but that's important. Agreements are things we're coming to together. And again, expectations can kind of end up this way, but we think about team agreements as being something that we're agreeing to together to say, this is what we agree to. And when we do these agreements, when we live up to these agreements, we're moving ourselves toward the culture that we want. Because if culture is the way we do things here, the agreements are the things that move us toward actually doing what we say we want. Mm-hmm. So they're connected 100%. They're just not exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. And to me, this circles back to one of your 3 C's, the communication. Actually, all 3 of them. But the communication, especially when somebody violates an agreement or doesn't live up to the standard that we've agreed to, the ability to, whether it's speaking up to the manager who may have fallen short of an agreement,
or peer
in all directions.
Yeah. I mean, one of the greatest powers of team agreements are the fact that we now have peer accountability. Because from my perspective, we don't have a team agreement unless everyone has looked each other in the face over the camera or face to face and say, I'll do that. I agree with that. And I will do that. And once everyone said that, then it makes it far easier, not just to hold people accountable for those behaviors, but to help them be accountable for those behaviors. It isn't just something that needs to become sort of a negative, right? But something that we can, if we've agreed that that will help us be more cohesive or have better communication or collaborate more effectively, then why wouldn't I want help from my peers to make sure I'm living up to that?
Mm-hmm. I just love that. It's so important. And I think it's just, don't you think oftentimes people assume, well, we have this agreement, even though we haven't talked about it, that there's so much that's operated under the umbrella of assumptions that we haven't ever clarified and actually agreed to. And it just seems like
100%.
it's the basis for so many issues that come up.
Well, the number one cause of workplace conflict is unclear or unmet expectations. I thought you were supposed to. No, I thought you were supposed to. Whose job is this? Not my job. It's your job. I thought everyone knew that on Fridays they need to take all of their stuff that they put in the lunchroom refrigerator out because we don't need that stuff being in there for 3 weeks and getting all nasty. Like someone else doesn't do that. Like I thought everyone did that. That's an assumption. No, we can set an agreement about that. And the reason I use that one is I've helped lots of teams do this over the years. And like the refrigerator ends up always being a thing. And I use that as the example because I don't think we put it in the book because while the book talks about doing this at a distance, everything we talk about applies, whether we're doing it at a distance, or we're doing it for a team that's together. We talk about the nuances of that. So I don't think we put the refrigerator thing in the book because it's like, well, that's very clearly that's a very clearly we're together thing. But the point that I want to make with that is that agreements don't have to just be about big stuff. It can be about the little stuff that we're just all on the same page about. Just be on the same page about. Mm-hmm. Assumptions don't serve anybody, right?
No, they get us into trouble. Well, I really appreciated in the book where you shared your own experience, of growing your own business and managing this long distance team. And I would love for you just to share a little bit what was involved in your own thought process, in your own development and lessons learned from going from a one-person solo consultant to having this team now that's spread out, and you function beautifully, because I've interacted with so many of the people on your team, and there's a consistency in behavior, in customer focus that I just love and enjoy. And so talk a little bit about what you did to design that team and create a culture at your organization.
Well, first of all, thank you for that feedback. That means a lot. I would just say that, so first of all, in terms of doing stuff at a distance, that we've just we've almost been that way, not from the very start, but for a very long time, well over a decade. I've been in business, as you said, starting out as just being Kevin, for nearly 30 years. But it's been a team for over 20 of that. And it's been a team that worked at a distance, at least some or all of the folks at a distance, for well over 10 of that. So I think we've learned a lot by working with our clients. We've also learned a lot that we've shared with our clients, which is kind of your question, I suppose. I would say that, I'll say it this way. In the long distance leader, we said, think leadership first, location second. In other words, there's way more that's the same about all of this, whether it's building your team, creating your culture, being a leader. There's way more of that is the same than is different. So the first thing I would say is I think we've tried to work from the profound underlying foundational principles. I've done my best to do those kinds of things. And then from that, say, okay, what do I have to do different because we're not all together so that we can remain cohesive, for example. So I think that tend to the principles and be intentional about the nuances.
What does that last part mean? Intentional about the nuances?
Well, so for example, if everyone this is a very concrete example. So if everyone's in the building, in the same workplace with some proximity, at least some of the time, we sort of figure out that eventually people are going to get to know each other. I have two people that joined our team during the pandemic, right? and everyone else working at a distance anyway, right? And so how are they going to get to know each other, let alone the rest of the team, unless we do intentional things, right? So one of the things that we've done for years is if someone joins our team within the first 2 weeks or so of them being on the job, they're going to have a 30-minute, years ago it was a phone call, now it's a Zoom, right? They're going to have a 30-minute conversation with every other member of the team. There's about 15 of us, just to give you context. And in that 30 minutes, they're not talking about work. In other words, I'm setting the expectation that I want you to get to know each other beyond the work and the weather, right? Now, if I need to talk to Josephine because we have this, I need to understand what she does and how it relates to my job, like that's work. Maybe it's in the same call, but it's not in that 20 to 30 minutes. We need, in other words, I'm setting the expectation that we need to get to know each other. And in the old days, we might not have had, I would actually propose now that we ought to do that anyway, even if everyone is together, but we didn't think about it before because, you know, osmosis, right? No osmosis now.
Mm-hmm.
There's a single example.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example too. So let's go back to what I was saying at the introduction about companies are now pushing in many cases or demanding or mandating that everybody come back to the office. And I know you have some thoughts about that. What's the flaw of that reasoning, and what do companies need to understand in order to not get hung up on everybody's got to be in the one place?
Well, the first thing I want to say, and it's a great question. First thing I want to say is, even though I've now co-written 3 books that have the word long distance in the title, there are a lot of people that are in this space who are sort of the fans of, zealots for, believe in sort of the digital nomad. People ought to be able to work wherever they want, et cetera, et cetera. That's not where we are. Where we are is, and to get to your answer to your question is, where, when, and how people work ought to be determined by the kinds of things we're talking about in this book. Like, what's the nature of the work? What will get us the best or the most balanced business results or organizational results, right? Leadership is about reaching valuable outcomes with and through others. And all of the tension that you're talking about, like, we need everyone to come back, is all saying, because we always did it that way and we know it will work, then we want you back. And yet the others are saying, and the Great Resignation said, well, we ain't coming back. Thank you very much, right? And so the problem with all of it isn't what the final answer is. The problem with it is we're asking the wrong questions, because we shouldn't be at war with each other about this. We shouldn't be at, like, because the media has said, okay, well, now unemployment's low, so now, you know, this is it's gonna swing, the power balance is gonna swing back to the employer, away from the employee. Like, stop thinking about it like that. We're on the same team, trying to achieve the same things. The question is, for our work, for the team that we have, for the culture that we want, what's the best way for us to do this? Now, I happen to believe that for many people, that ends up being something that's flexible, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's in where or when or how or all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, we should be making those decisions based on our micro situation, not based on some person or group's personal preference, whether that's senior leaders or whether that's team members. Mm-hmm. Right? Neither should feel as a hostage to the other. Neither should be saying, like, we're going to win this battle. It's not a war. Shouldn't be a war at all.
Well, to me, this all goes back to those 3 C's: being willing to communicate and listen to each other to find out what the needs are. And, you know, thinking about the cohesion, I really liked some of the points you made. And I think I'd like us to kind of wrap up with that, because this is so important. This idea of, because it ties in to me the whole belonging piece. You know, do I belong here? Do I fit here? Am I valued? Do I matter? So talk a little bit about from your perspective, why that C is so critical, and what could leaders do or team members do to help build the cohesion of a team?
We in North America for sure. That's where I have research to sort of make this statement to be knowingly true. Before we had a pandemic of a virus, we had an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Like that already existed. Then humans have a need to belong, and we can and have, and maybe even you could argue should, use work as one of those places to find that sense of belonging. And it's missing for many people. And so if we can create an organization where people feel like I make a difference here with my work, but I make a difference here because of the people that I work with and interact with, and I can make their lives better as I'm doing my work and making a living, then that's powerful. And so cohesion comes down to thinking about that being possible. Cohesion comes down to building relationships. Cohesion comes down to trust and respect and the kinds of things that we all really want, even if we've never experienced it at work yet.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Kevin, I just love who you are, what you share. This book is so important. I hope everyone that's listening will pick up a copy of it. The Long Distance Team. If you're committed to creating a culture where people thrive and designing a team where people have this whole communication, collaboration, and cohesion, I just think this is a fabulous guide to give you very specific and practical strategies for doing just that.
I thank you for those kind words. If I can say one more thing before we go,
Yeah.
For all of you that are listening to this when this first comes out, when this episode first drops, the book is just out. You can always go to longdistanceteambook.com and learn more about what's going on with the book and get an excerpt and all that sort of stuff. But right now, we're doing an executive discussion panel on the 29th of March. And to get a ticket to that, you just got to buy a couple copies of the book and you get 2 tickets, right? So like you're listening, because some people, Meredith, who are listening to this are saying this, man, this is awesome, but we need someone in senior leadership to hear this. You can go to the website and you can buy two copies for the price of one and get 2 tickets to this forum. And so this virtual forum. So get 2 copies, give one to that person you're thinking of in the back of your head right now. And both of you come join Wayne, my co-author, and I, and one of our clients as we talk through how some of this is working in the real world. And I think it will be very, very much a blessing for you and your team. So I hope you do that as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. And how can people connect with you, Kevin, if they want to follow you and learn more about you and your work?
Well, since Blessing and Curse, then the company is named after me. So if you can spell Kevin Eikenberry, you can find us. KevinEikenberry.com, KevinEikenberry.me. Follow me on LinkedIn, all the social channels, lots and lots of video, lots and lots of blog posts, all that sort of stuff. But, if you're looking, other than going to longdistanceteambook.com, LinkedIn is probably as good a place as any. And lots of content that I share there on a regular basis. And I would love to have you reach out and connect and say, I heard you and your conversation with Meredith. I'd love that.
Oh, that would be great. I want to encourage my listeners to do that because Kevin does post great content. He also offers some wonderful summits and other educational programs that I've been on before and can highly recommend.
And they're free.
Hmm?
And they're free.
And they're free. That's right. So do connect with Kevin and get a copy of this great book. And Kevin, thank you again for the important work you do. I really appreciate who you are, what you've built with your team, and the impact you're having.
Thanks, Meredith.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free Facilitator Guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.